teach you by the first name? No? You would like a folk school. It's pretty good. So that's what it's all about, and it's just to learn for the fun of learning. And along the way, I'm not exactly how I remember meeting Michael, but we met someplace. It's been now, can't even remember how we first initially connected. And I said blacksmithing was pretty neat. Actually, I had met a couple of fellows down in Florida. The Stephen C. Foster Cultural Center had a blacksmithing program, and Campbell's has a large one. And I said, this is pretty neat stuff. When I tell people about blacksmithing, everybody always thinks about putting horseshoes on. I don't know why, but that's a farrier. A farrier is the people that work with horseshoes and metals and anvils. But a blacksmith, the way I equate it when people come here is I say a blacksmith is what the True Value Hardware, the Home Depot, and the Lowe's all put together were. In the old days, if you needed nails, you would go to your local blacksmith. If you needed a hinge, if you needed an axe, if you needed a shovel, if there was anything you couldn't fix, your wagon. If you were in this part of the country, if you needed logging tools for forestry or saws, that was your blacksmith. So anything that had to be made, there was no Home Depot. You would either make it yourself or have a blacksmith make it for you. And Michael is quite an accomplished blacksmith. I give him a hard time every day, and look how tired he is. He taught 2 classes at once today. But we had originally had a presentation set up with a gentleman who was coming from Sacramento, California. Michael introduced me to Mark Asprey. And unfortunately, he had a motorcycle accident someplace on the way. I guess he got out through California. I'm not sure how much farther east he got on his motorcycle. But Michael is just an accomplished blacksmith, and I think you'll enjoy it. Those that are taking his classes here today can attest to he's quite a skilled fellow. I'll let him tell you about where he's been and kind of people he's worked with. If there is interest at the end and you want to fire up one of the forges afterwards for a few minutes, we can do that. If the young folks here would rather roast marshmallows, we can do that. Or we can do them both at the same time.
Yeah.
So
not in the same fire.
Not in the same fire. So Michael, I'll let you present, and if there's some folks come in, we'll pull them in quietly. But Michael McCarthy, why don't you tell them your background?
I think it was Walt Fleming that introduced us, but
I think you're right.
I saw this setup and I came in tonight and I thought Jim was being a little overzealous. The last presentation was birds of prey.
And we had them all the way up.
Which stuffed people right out onto the lawn. But you know, birds of prey versus blacksmithing, sort of no low contender there. But anyway, I started smithing at a pretty young age. I think I was like 9 or 10 or something. I started with a family friend who was a farrier, and I really came at it through art. So I was more interested in creating tools for wood sculpture and other things that I was doing. By the time I was 12 or so, I had made shaving horses and things like that. And so that's sort of what brought me to the craft of blacksmithing. Was coming from an art standpoint, I was just wanted to make my own tools, basically. And then I guess that is, if I'm blatantly honest, I'm a bit of a control freak, which is kind of funny because I have I'm pretty laid back in my life, but apparently I'm kind of a control freak with my craft. I constantly seek out new places to learn. I've studied and worked with blacksmiths now on every continent except for Antarctica. I don't think there are any there. If any show up there, I'll go up there and see. But so I've worked on the African continent, in Asia, in Europe, and Great Britain and whatnot. And probably the most important place though that I worked was at the Farmers Museum, and that's what this slideshow is going to be about. I met a fellow there by the name of Paul Spaulding, who was pretty formative for my career. He really sort of introduced a path to me that was based around the historic record. And there's a very famous saying that people, contemporary smiths, when they arc weld work or they do something that's they'll MIG weld something, and they'll always say, if you ask them why they use that technique, they'll always say, well, if blacksmiths 200 years ago had arc welders, they would have used them. That's always sort of what you'll hear it over and over in the field. And my answer to them is always, granted that may be true, but you have access to an incredible historic record of design and technique. Why won't you use it? And that was sort of the gift that Paul gave to me, was that the idea that this record is pretty incredible. So there are places where arc welding can save you time and effort, and I use it freely. There are places where MIG welding and other, machining and whatnot can save you time and effort, and I use them freely. So I don't want this presentation to leave you with the impression that I'm a staunch traditionalist. That's not my position at all. If I seek anything in this trade, it's efficiency, not tradition. So I started with Paul in 1998, 1999, and this slideshow encompasses the range of work that we did from 98 to roughly, I think 2001. I think that's about where it ends. There's a few slides in there from about 2005 onwards. So right around 2005, I have another slideshow that's separate, but it's very focused on bloomery smelting. So in 98, 99, when I first called Paul, I asked him if he had ever made his own iron up at the Farmers Museum, and he said no, and this was before I was hired there. I said, well, you got to hire me, we'll come up and we'll make iron, I didn't realize what a ridiculous statement that was at the time. I just thought, well, this will be a fun thing to make some iron. And simultaneously, I had a friend of mine, Lee Souter in Virginia, who just sort of came up with the same idea. And it's turned into pretty ridiculous quest to find different bloomery smelting techniques and whatnot. So we'll get into that. Smelting, when you put that little S on the front of that word, there's a whole lot of technology that depends off that S. And smelting as opposed to melting, what smelting means is that you're actually taking the iron from the rock ore itself. The Adirondacks in particular are a great region for that. There's magnetite in the Adirondacks, which is an extremely rich ore, and this region led the nation in iron production around the time of the Civil War with what is known as the Adirondack bloomery. And Jim and I have danced around this issue for quite a while, but if I have my way, we'll build an Adirondack bloomery here and be smelting, so you guys don't have to worry about that. The small little piece here is an example of bloomery iron. So this is a pipe tomahawk, which is an example of traditional work, and you're welcome to come up and grab it, and just don't whack it into anything iron. I've always shy away from handing out tools to people in the public from my experiences at the museum. I've seen people take an axe, look at it, and then immediately just whack it right into an anvil or something. Wonder what in the world they're thinking. But this is a piece, this is a contemporary piece. I'll turn it around, but then I'll slide it out of the way. This is an example of a collaboration my brother and I are working on now that involves bloomery iron, and we're actually sort of painting and working the iron in different ways. And this is another piece along that vein. So I'm going to swing these out of the way. You're welcome to look at them, but this fellow's recording and I don't want to get in his way. So, do you have any questions about anything before we get started? Or we can get started and then I'll just sit back here and you guys can just ask questions as you come up with them. Just feel free to. We'll go sort of, there's about 20 minutes worth of material if we hustle through it. So I don't know how long this is supposed to go.
As long as they like it.
So we can, so we'll just go, feel free to ask questions and we'll answer them as we go. It might be the easiest way to do it. Throughout this presentation, I think what I'm going to do is just, the convention I'm going to use is to just say we. Some of these works are solely mine. One of the things I pursue is what I call sole authorship, S-O-L-E, sole authorship. And by that I mean that I have, from the ore, using no power tools, actually wrested from the earth personally myself 1 or 2 items, a hammer, an axe, and a few items that no other human being had any influence on. And that is, I think, an exceedingly rare thing. I'm not sure when that has ever happened historically. Other pieces were made by other people in the shop. So I'm just going to use the convention we because it's basically, this slideshow is the work of a team, so we'll just call it we. If you want to know specifically who did exactly what on anything, you can ask, but I don't think it would be very relevant to the presentation. So the Farmers Museum, it's in Cooperstown, for anybody who doesn't know, and it's, I don't want to make Jim nervous, it's not an advertisement or a presentation for the Farmers Museum, so just keep in mind that the Adirondack Folk School can have all of this dripping in ironwork just as much as the Farmers Museum if you give us time. Those sign brackets are about 60 inches long, and they were taken from an historic pattern book. I'll revisit that later in the slideshow, but that's sort of the three spheres within historic work that we operate within. If you sort of pull back the focus to get the broadest and most general resolution on historic work that you can get, you're left with three categories. Pieces that are made as direct copies from the historic record. In other words, you have an object and you're sort of recreating that exact object. Pieces that are made as that were inspired by the historic record. So in other words, you've seen things within the historic record and they inspired you to create something. And then the third category would be things that are made extempore, but within the context of the technique and design elements. This is an example of the first order that was literally just taken from a pattern book. There are always certain adaptations, but the little one on the post is the same thing. That's the front entrance, and the little one on the post, the next few are sort of gratuitous shots, but just to sort of give you a scene of the village in which the work was done. Actually, quite a nice little operating farm. So when I was there, there were 5 farmers, I think 3 or 4 full-time, 3 for sure, I think it might have been 4, full-time farmers, and about a dozen carpenters. So I was actually very lucky. I got to serve my apprenticeship at a time when the museum was more than doubling really what its capacity. So I got to make ironwork for carpenters, masons, and workmen as if I were actually in a 19th century apprenticeship. I was, of course, in a 20th century apprenticeship, but with no power whatsoever, we were producing ironwork at a pretty rapid clip. Just a shot of the pharmacy buildings and tavern. So that's the blacksmith shop. That was moved from New Berlin, probably called New Berlin before the World War, but now it's New Berlin. And that was the Pellig Field Blacksmith Shop with Smith from Scituate, Rhode Island, that settled down in that section of New York. Had a pretty well-appointed shop. By all accounts, there was a water-powered trip hammer in that shop. It was referred to as Field's Trip Hammer Works, and they did things like sharpening plowshares and making sledgehammers and refacing, re-steeling sledgehammers and things that are associated with the larger work that's associated with having a trip hammer. There was no trip hammer there when I was working there, which is really sad. I've worked under one and they're pretty awesome. I would love to have been able to work under one there for all those years. Here's another example of a sign bracket, and this is sort of in the second order. This was taken sort of from various examples. I'm going to speak sort of to the philosophy of blacksmithing. I think that's what Mark was going to do, so trying to stay in the spirit of his slideshow, I'm going to sort of speak to this philosophy that I keep alluding to. When we made this, Paul would not let me make a scroll jig. I said, well, that's coming from my shop. This is an easy thing. We'll just make a scroll jig, we'll bang out these scrolls, and we'll be done. And he wouldn't let me do that. There's a gate as well that we did, a few other things that involved quite a few scrolls. And he actually made me make all these scrolls by hand. And did that throughout my tenure there, and it really stuck with me. And now, when someone comes to me, I am free to look at the architecture of the space, their needs, their wants and desires, and really design something that fits the building or the space, rather than designing something that fits my scroll jig. So rather than taking my existing tools and forcing them on the work, I'm actually able to let the work sort of grow into its own space, which is a nice sort of a subtlety. So I did a preview of this show for 2 people that can't make it tonight, Susan and Will. And Susan asked me, well, can't you just make a scroll jig every time? You can't, but that never really ever happens. Another little tiny sign there. This is the interior of the door. We're doing hinges and hardware for our class, so this is kind of an interest to that class. This is a late 19th century style hardware with very straight lines, and then it just tapers to the round pad at the end, you can see that 2/3 of that hinge has no taper whatsoever, completely from rolled stock. Those are earlier types. Those are Dutch style hinges, and they taper through the whole section, and then there's that fancy pad. That's sort of what I drew earlier. And there's the third type. So they taper. They have a little fancier end. They're tapered throughout. And incidentally, that lock on the door is wooden with iron guts. And that's a Banbury style lock. It was a pretty common style of lock in the 19th century. The case itself was wooden. All the parts are still metal. There's a common door latch. It's known as the Suffolk type. The Norfolk type, which I do not have a picture of, it's too bad too, because I just did an order for probably a dozen Norfolk latches, and I didn't take a picture. I should have taken a picture of those. But the Norfolk type has a continuous backplate, so it's a handle that's riveted onto an iron backplate. It's an iron stock lock we built. The slide is not upside down. I think I've seen 5 or 6 original 19th century locks in that area of New York. And every one of them, without fail, is mounted upside down. And the reason for that is that lock mounts flush to one side of the door. It's not mortised into the door. So if you turn that lock over, it has to be on the other side of the door. And for whatever reason, the carpenters never just hung the door on the other side. They've always turned the lock over. I have no idea why that would be. But there it is. We did another type of lock, which was all cast brass, which is an American pattern lock. I'll show a slide. Again, if you guys have any questions, just fire them off. So just a little shot of the gate, another little gate, and a third little gate. That gate's kind of interesting. This is an example of the second order. We found something in the historic record that seemed interesting and sort of inspired this work. This was a description in a book on husbandry written around, I think, 1820, if I'm not mistaken, 1817, 1820. And it described a method by which a smith could make a self-closing gate. So when this gate opens, it fools itself into thinking it's out of level. If you sight the line between the gate and the post, you'll notice that it widens at the base, kicking the gate uphill. It does that with a pretty clever device. At the bottom of the gate, there's an iron tree that grabs 2 pins. Because the moment on a gate is created so that the top hinge is in tension, the bottom in compression, if that makes any sense. If you think of a door, it wants to fall off of its top hinge. So as it would rotate and falling, it would push in on the bottom hinge. So that bottom hinge doesn't actually need to be captured. You just ride in this crazy little loose staple. And it throws it to either side. So the gate actually works in both directions and is self-closing. It's pretty kind of a cool design. That's a cemetery gate that exists in Cooperstown. And it was the inspiration that you could just barely see tiny little scrollwork at the top. And it was the inspiration for the gate that we produced for the cemetery. I think we made 3 top rails for that. I can't remember. This is something that Jeanette and I were discussing earlier. The eye, the physiology of the eye is such that our brain and eye use vertical members as a way to interpret distance. And so the eye is extremely sensitive to vertical elements. So when you have a design that's dominated by vertical elements, it has to be very precise, or it looks all wonky. And I think, if I remember correctly, it took us 3 shots to get that right. Because every time we put it together, it looked all wonky. The reason for that is that you're punching a bar, it's going to stretch and grow. So COSIRA, if anybody's familiar with that, that's the Council of Small Industries in Rural Areas. It's a British group that put together a little book about how to be a blacksmith, basically, to help out rural smiths in England. And they describe a method by which you lay out and punch harrows with a little gauge. And I used that, and sure enough, it worked. Years later, I was in Omaha,
at this place called Hot Shops. And there was a young kid who was drilling out this rail in all these little holes. And I said, hey man, what are you doing? He said, well, we're making this railing section. I'm drilling them all out, so we'll have the locations when we go to drifting. I said, man, that's pretty hot. I'm going to file that away and use that someday. And like 12 years later, I got this commission for a long rail, and I thought, wow, this is perfect. This is a great way to put, use that technique that I saw. And it was atrocious. It was horrible. It worked. It did not work. It was like pushed this off on. I went right back to the Cosira little harrow gauge, and it was beautiful. It came out within, I think, a 30-second over the entire rail. Drilling and drifting was just a nightmare. So that's a candelabra that, now it's Jeffrey, so you can see the top. There were, I think, 5 of those made for a church. I have a little funny story. A friend of my wife and mine was getting married in this church, and the church, I don't know how this worked, but they somehow, you couldn't have the candelabras in your wedding unless you rented them separately within the church. That's a pretty sharp maneuver, I thought. And so she was telling my wife about this, and she said, yeah, we're getting married in this church, and you can rent these candelabras, and we're going to rent them because they're awesome for our wedding. And my wife said, oh, the ones my husband made. And well-meaning friend, but she said, no, these are really nice. Gives you an idea of what most people think of blacksmithing. Jim was talking about what people think of blacksmiths, what they imagine we do. That's a toaster, traditional toaster. That's an example also of the second order. So we sort of went through all these. This is one thing that Paul really excels at. When you look at the historic record, it really, the pieces within the historic record do fall within the 80-20 rule. Unfortunately, 80% of the designs are just garbage. They're just really poor work. Sometimes they're executed poorly to boot. And Paul's has this incredible talent for looking into the historic record and creating these compilations that remove all the stupidities of multiple pieces and really come together quite nicely. And this toaster is one example. I've made probably half a dozen or so of these. They're really pretty neat little pieces. And I think its design is great. Also, the benefit of that is that design, it shows up on your toast. That's a set of Coach Makers wrenches, and just did those kind of for fun. This was sort of a side project that I did just kind of a little bit of fun, and it was a design that I found in some book. I made it a little more difficult by welding the knobs on the ends. So the way they're done traditionally is a little bit simpler. What I did was actually work out the slot size so that it just fit over the round part of that bar. So I actually punched them round, and then as I worked them up the bar, I had to reforge them flat again so they would fit on the rectangular portion, just so other smiths would wonder how the heck they were made. But not you guys, because I just told you. And then I welded the collars. But they're pretty neat. You use one wrench to whack the wedge of another, and that's how they're adjusted. They would certainly be a nightmare before Reagan's Fastener Act in the 1980s, but when you're dealing with square nuts that you find on old carriages, they work pretty well. So there's an example of the first order. This is a race knife, and race knives are used by timber framers to carve patterns in the timbers so they can identify. If you think about a timber frame building, it's comprised of all these different constituent elements that are cut out individually and then reassembled on site. And sometimes that site is quite far away. There were homes made in the Northeast here in America during the 18th century that were shipped to the Caribbean and reassembled. So there was a pretty elaborate code system used to identify which beams went where. The Farmers Museum was always moving buildings while I was there. They're not in the building moving buildings. But during my tenure, they were always moving buildings. And we had this carpenter who had all these little aluminum asset tags that he had found somewhere. And he was crawling all over the timbers, and he would tack these asset tags and scrawl, A, B, and A prime and B prime. He had this complicated alphanumeric system that he worked out. And then he got back to the museum and could not make sense of his own system, and ended up using the old marks that the original carpenters had made of the building, and were able to reassemble it. They did get two beams reversed, which was kind of funny because there was a mortise in the floor on one side of the building and a mortise in the ceiling on the other. That's a hot pole pulling device for pulling hot poles. Anyone who can say that 5 times fast, you can win a free item from me. It's a pretty ridiculous thing to have to say. But when you're pulling hot poles, you just set that in position, and then you can jack a pole right out of the ground. It looks like a little, it's sort of trapezoidal in section. So those little iron jaws to the left are constantly levering tighter as you pull. Kind of a neat device. You probably could manufacture that today and sell quite a few of them for pulling poles out of there. Works pretty well. That was a set of, this is another side project, so little tools, I guess. I'm sort of breaking convention, but just to explain to you, these are sort of side trips I take into the historic record. There's a book written by a family that produced lathes in England. The name of the family is Holtzacker. And they have a pretty classic series of books on turning and mechanical manipulation. And this was a set of turning tools that they described for brass and iron for turning on a treadle lathe, which we happen to have in the shop. And so I produced this set so that I could do turnings in steel and brass. In fact, that set turned the ferrules for that set. They're made out of horseshoes with steel welded on. Horseshoes were all folded up, welded up, and then steel was welded onto the tips. It happened to be the best wrought iron I had at the time, so that's why I used the horseshoe. Years later, I found myself in a discussion on the internet in a forum on home shop machining. And the discussion went on for some days with quite a bit of confusion on everyone's part, until I realized that the discussion they were having on hand turning meant that they were turning the knobs on their lathes by hand. So I was we were having this discussion on hand turning, and I was saying these things, and everyone was responding like, "You're crazy. What are you talking about? You lower your tool rest to do it below. You can't lower your tool rest below center to accommodate the cutter." And it took us some time until I realized that they were working on regular modern lathes, but they were actually just turning the knobs by hand, and that was their hand turning. I don't know if anyone knows how a machine lathe works, but this is a file making set. So when I mentioned I was a control freak before, this really was a great environment for me because it was a shop full of control freaks. So we got into our heads that we were going to make files. This is a 18th century, 19th century file maker's kit. So we made our own file making kit, made files. My friend Bob Cierney was known for months as the blue thumb because he would sit in the corner of the shop just chiseling the teeth into files, and all you hear is whack, 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 thump, ow! Those are some of the parts for the brass locks that I was talking about before. So Americans couldn't compete with the English or the Europeans because we just didn't have the pica. So it's still a problem today. Material costs fairly low, labor costs fairly high in America even to this day. And we just couldn't throw the numbers of people that the Brits or the Europeans could. So in order to get around that, American manufacturers chose to invest a relatively high amount up front in an expensive material, brass. But in the long term, they could lower their labor costs by hiring relatively unskilled people to ram up molds and cast those parts in brass. So the little square in the lower right corner is part of a door latch. The wooden bar in the lower left corner is part of a strike plate, and the rest of that are the tools associated with casting brass. The little flask is made out of oak, and the ramming board with the wooden key, which now shows up here a little larger, shows you 3 of the keys we made with an iron key below that comparison. I love making keys. I love casting keys, I love forging keys. They're just they're a neat thing, and they are the root of a lock. So you can rekey an existing lock, but you can't make a new lock without a key in this tradition. This I threw in here kind of for fun. That's a water wagon. If the space shuttle had a hood ornament, it would be a Studebaker hood ornament. And that water wagon is also a Studebaker. So in case you thought that Studebaker just died as a company, they went from 19th century coaches and wagons to building the space shuttle. It's a pretty successful blacksmithing firm, I would think. These are the steps in making the pipe tomahawk. I brought one here. For various reasons, these are all failures. But basically, the bar at the bottom shows that you first forge out a little, sort of a butterfly. The bar at the top shows that you punch a hole in the middle of that. And the bar in the center shows a stud welded in where that hole is punched. And then, if you look at the upper right, you wrap a collar around the stud that shows in the lower right. And the upper left shows a complete forging for a reproduction axe. This was sort of my first big solo reproduction. This was for the Campbell axe. And I was really sort of consciously trying to pace myself so that I could achieve it. This is a pretty ambitious project to reproduce this pipe tomahawk. I was really sort of trying to pace myself and not burn myself out, and kind of intentionally not get excited about this project. I ended up leaving that axe in the pickle for like 3 weeks and forgetting. I actually absolutely forgot that I had made it. And it ate it so badly that it was completely unusable, otherwise a usable forging. But that's why that one's a failure. It's sort of interesting because you really can see the grain structure there. It really ate away the silica and left a very ropey, cloddy grain structure. That's the completed Campbell pipe tomahawk. Even the beads are accurate within a few thousandths. They had to make custom beading tools, knurling tools for the bowl. The handle is poured pewter, which is a technique we're going to do here at some point, called a flow in. You do it in wood or steel. And then the little brass tacks were made all by hand with a punched out dome. A little tiny iron spike was made up, and then that little tiny iron spike was soldered into the brass tack. I think there's just some various views of that. That's the full one. This was left, called the Campbell axis, in the family of Joseph Campbell. And it was left after the raid on Cherry Valley. Cannot remember when that raid was. I think it was 17, I don't remember, it was the 18th century, I can't remember. It should be the other side of the axe, I'm not sure why it's the same side. That's another axe, and that is the Butler axe. And the Butler axe was given to William Butler. And so pipe axes were made up. Pretty much everyone smoked, and everyone carried an axe. So it was really sort of a neat little thing. It was not just for Native Americans. Lewis and Clark bought a pipe axe before they went on their expedition. They considered that a necessary piece of equipment. Whole regiments of American riflemen carried them. So they weren't sort of this Native American thing which people associate with them today. They were, of course, traded among and with Native Americans, and they were used to seal treaties and deals and things like that. They were given as presentation gifts. The work on that is similar to the work on the one on the table. It's inlaid in fine gold and silver, and then the bands and bowl are made up in coin silver. Interesting story behind this. It was inspired by a real historic axe, this Butler axe. And that axe, which I think now is in the Earl of Warwick's collection, was owned by Eugene Thaw, who was a huge collector of Native American artifacts. And Mr. Thaw expressly forbid reproduction of that axe, saying that he had spent his life trying to tell originals from fakes, and basically, if he allowed us to reproduce it, he wouldn't be able to tell the difference, and he didn't want to be changed. So he wouldn't let us. It was his axe. There's nothing we could do. So this is not a reproduction of the Butler. It's simply inspired by the Butler. Happens to look dramatically similar to the original. Everywhere Butler used silver, gold was used here. Everywhere Butler used pewter, silver was used. So sort of upgraded the metal slightly. One side is the sun, the other side is the moon. All right, so this takes us to a little bit of the smelting now. So that little pile of wood this took place in Minnesota, I think back in 2001, with Akira Kihara, who's the intangible cultural asset in Japan. He's the head of the Sword Preservation Society. He makes all of the steel for the traditional samurai swords. And I was pretty lucky to have a chance to work with him. That pit is 3 foot by 3 foot square, about 3 feet deep. And you stack it full of split wood, light it off, and let it burn. And then tamp the resulting charcoal into the hole while people watch, because you're the only one stupid and crazy enough to stand on a burning pile of charcoal while you tamp it. And you do that for like 3 days. For 3 days, I tamped this stupid charcoal into a hole to create a dry enough hole. You just tamp and tamp the stupid charcoal every day for 3 days. You just burn it, light it, you get a little bit of a break, then you have to rush in there and lose your eyebrows while you tamp this hole again for 3 days. And when the hole is finally totally filled with charcoal and it's like hard like concrete, you then start to build this little Kodai furnace, which is a version of the furnace that was sort of introduced to Japan about 75 AD by the Koreans. The Japanese did incredible things with this furnace. They're the only ones to do this, but they figured out that if you grow a furnace section as a round furnace, think of the blast furnaces that we use in America, the big blast furnaces that we use. If you grow a furnace section as a circle, you run into the problem that as you double the circumference or as you double the diameter, you increase the volume by 8 times, and that creates a pretty unworkable situation pretty rapidly. You just can't grow a furnace much bigger than a blast furnace. But if you grow it linearly, in other words, as a rectangle, you then have no limits, because the width of the furnace remains a constant and you're only growing the length. So these little tiny Kodai that you see here grew into the enormous Japanese tatara that make over 2,000 pounds of steel in one whack. They make over a ton of steel in a whack. They make a bloom which for me is about the size of a volleyball. And they make a bloom that is the size of a Volkswagen, because they were able to grow these furnaces as rectangles. Pretty remarkable system. That's the base of the furnace, and then you bisque fire it. Put a second section on top of that, and you bisque fire that. Then you do a salt ceremony and bless the furnace, and you begin smelting. And once the furnace is in blast, you have to feed it regularly. I think for about 32 hours, we fed this furnace alternating charges of ore and charcoal. So there's ore that goes in, and then charcoal that goes in. And then ore that goes in, and charcoal that goes in. And so you're already pretty exhausted from tamping this stupid hole for 3 days, and now you have to feed this furnace for an additional 32 hours with no sleep or break. You can see why earlier I was saying that it turned into a fairly ridiculous quest. If you see, at some point I can show you, and there are some online, I guess, some of the, I was invited a few years ago to the festival Wet Bean Day in Burkina Faso, and some of the African furnaces are enormous. Guys just climb inside them to load them and whatnot, like little buildings. That's a pretty good shot of the whole furnace. You can see the multiple tweers, which are one aspect of the tatara or Kodai that Western furnaces don't employ. You can see there are actually 8 tweers. And by tweer, what I mean for you guys that aren't familiar with furnaces, if you look at the lower part of that furnace, there are 2 wings that protrude off it. And on either side of those wings, the big clay boxes on the side are just diffusion boxes. So air is piped into those boxes, and then it enters the furnace through those 4 pipes that go down into the bottom. Each of those pipes is known as a tweer, or haguchi in Japanese, which is pretty neat. The character is supposed to give you the image of a feather waving. All right. It's sort of a different system of language. Haguchi is supposed to make you think of a feather waving in the breeze. So the furnace produces slag, which is when you're smelting, smelters, again, I have this tendency to pull my focus out to the broadest possible resolution. And so when you're smelting, there are two categories of stuff. And those two categories are what you're after, in my case iron, and everything else. And everything else is known as gangue or slag. And that gangue could actually contain other things that other people want. It could contain gold, it could contain copper, it could contain all kinds of things, but for iron smelting, you don't want it. So it's just dragged out of the furnace at regular intervals so it doesn't foul up the bloom. There's some rolling out now, you can see this slag rolling out the bottom of the furnace. Every once in a while you have to patch the furnace. So it's just clay, so it will melt and burn through. And there is the first iron bar I ever produced, so the tiny little bloom fragment, a little plate, and a little bar. Most of my work is sort of from the gut, so I don't really have scales or anything like that. But the lump of bloom, the lump of ore on the left there, that's Adirondack magnetite. So that's magnetite that came out of the Adirondacks. The little fragments are bloom fragments from a pit smelt that I did. The little tiny bar is the bar that resulted from that. And then the little hammer on the right is the first of those items that I was telling you about earlier. So every bit of that hammer, as stupid as it looks, was produced entirely by me. Then we go back to using weed because I can't really say, there's so much involved with smelting iron that it gets pretty silly pretty fast. So this is another sort of interesting area that I have fallen into, and that's charcoal making. This is a traditional charcoal maker's kiln or clamp. And so it's just a heap of wood covered with leaves, and then you light that off, and it's another sort of 32-hour work festival, where at the end of it, when you're just about as tired and worn out as you can be, you open up a blazing clamp filled with red-hot charcoal that wants to catch the whole wood on fire. So it's kind of a fun, I'll have to do that sometime here, Joe. I think you'll like it. That's the clamp just smoldering down. I've actually, just teasing you, Jim, we've come up with several very, very safe ways to make charcoal, so we can actually offer that here as a class. And then we built a bellows to fire the forges, so that's a traditional blacksmith bellows. We actually built two pairs. I think that pair remains unskinned. It's still there, I think. We hung one pair in the front forge and the other pair we fixed. After, we used it for smelting for a while. This is a shot of cutting a bloom. So that's me with a hammer on the left, and I already burned those pants in half, so not really much I could do. We're cutting this bloom in half. This is a little bloom that we pulled out. And that's the half bloom, just to show you what these blooms sort of look like, the texture and whatnot. And I have a good friend by the name of Daryl Markowitz who also smelts up in Canada. And he's extremely precise. Really precise, I think, almost to the point of distraction. But I'm so loose in my work, I really do everything just sort of from the gut. And so he always was complaining that here I've had this, 8 years or whatever of research, whatever it was at the time. I think this was in 2005. And, he was saying, all these 6 years of research have gone undocumented by you. I said, well, they're not undocumented, Daryl. I got all the stuff, and, I've shown it, I do this stuff. He says, yeah, but you don't document. No, you don't know. You don't have sizes, you don't have scales. And he always has these meter scales. I said, well, I'll tell you what, Daryl, I'll make a deal with you. Every time I take a picture of a bloom, I'll put a chili pepper in it, because I always eat chili peppers as I smelt. Everybody knows the size of a chili pepper. And then it occurred to me that if I make a little stand out of coat hanger or wire or whatever's laying around, I can actually use the chili pepper to indicate clear angle and direction, so I can actually convey more information with the chili pepper. But he wasn't satisfied with that, so he forced me to take a picture of my chili pepper with the scale, which is what I mean by sort of being precise to distraction, because I'm never going to use that same chili pepper again. But so that that's a standard centimeter scale. And there's the chili pepper. So that's pretty much a perfectly formed bloom. That's what the guys in the Adirondacks were going after. Has a well-formed rim, that circular section around the outside, you can see there's almost a raised internal portion. As long as you can keep that outside rim unbroken, you can create really fantastic iron. Super malleable iron, it doesn't need to be refined, very, very soft, welds to itself and other things like glue. Really incredible. The problem is keeping that rim unbroken. It's incredibly difficult. As tweer angle goes up, the bloom rises. The higher the tweer angle goes, the higher the bloom rises, and the higher the carbon content of the resulting bloom, which makes it untenable for welding, more brittle, friable under the hammer, and generally more difficult to work. So if you go to all the way to the extreme with a very steep bloom angle, the bloom actually attempts to grow around the tweer. It can, of course, because the air continues to saw it down. But it forms these really beautiful hands that try to reach out and close around the tweer. It's sort of like torturing iron into existence. It doesn't want to come into the world, and it actually attempts to stop the tweer. It can't because the air blast keeps sawing it out with its hands. There's another pretty perfect bloom, and that pepper indicates the optimal angle, which is fairly flat. The tweer itself is tapered, so the pepper actually works pretty well. About 7 degrees. Another one, you can see there the difference. See how it's just slightly higher? But what a difference it makes in the bloom. So the lower angle, the almost flat angle, this nice, beautiful, flat, gorgeous bloom. With a higher angle, you grow a really high, stupid bloom. It just doesn't work as well. And then these are some pieces I just threw in here for gratuitous eye candy. It's a French-style doorknob. Corkscrew. This was pulled out of Delamont's Decorative Antique Ironwork. Almost every blacksmith has a copy of that. It's a really great book. Dover reprints it. If you don't have it, go get it. It's gorgeous. What's funny is I finally made it to Rouen, and the book is black and white, and those darn grapes are all inlaid gold in the original. You just can't tell because the book is black and white. That's a needle case. So that is where you would keep your sewing needles inside. And this next piece is where the lamp blinked out on us last time. Oh, not there. That's a fork. There's the corkscrew from the beginning. Obviously that case, that piece on the bottom where the grapes are carved, that unscrews, revealing the corkscrew. You don't obviously try to remove a cork with that. Although I guess it would work. Just shove it down in. I've done that. That's a scale so that piece was made by Paul Spaulding. That's the final piece, and I just wanted to show this as an example of some of what I consider Paul's finest work. Not only is it aesthetically pleasing and kind of neat, but balance scales like that are not known for their accuracy. They're more sort of famous for their symbolism. But Paul is such an incredible, meticulous smith. You may not believe it when I say this, but he's actually prepared special weights for that scale so that you can use it as a balance scale. And you can take a small piece of paper the size of a quarter, throw it on that scale and weigh it so that thing balances. Take that piece of paper off and make a very, very light 1/4-inch mark in pencil and throw it back on there and it will tip that scale. Actually weigh a very fine 1/4-inch long mark in the graphite. It's really incredibly sensitive. At some point I'd like to have a slideshow just based on Paul's work. It's pretty. His work is almost as if elves made it, the way that it works. Very complicated machines that are very precise. I think that's the last slide, so if you guys have any questions, we can raise the lights and discuss this stuff, or what might be even more fun is just to go out into the shop and show you how some of this stuff works and ask questions out there.